There is a specific pattern in history that repeats itself with such precision that it might as well be written into the laws of physics. When a government begins to destroy its own currency to finance expenditures it cannot afford through legitimate taxation, a doom loop begins that has never been broken by any civilization in recorded history. The initial inflation creates economic distress. The government responds by printing more money to ease that distress. The additional money printing causes more inflation. The cycle accelerates until the currency becomes worthless and the civilization that depended on it collapses into chaos. We are watching this exact pattern unfold across the Western world right now, and every signal indicates we are much further into the doom loop than most people realize. For decades, I have studied monetary history, and the lesson is always the same. Once a nation crosses the threshold where it begins systematically debasing its currency, the outcome is mathematically certain. The only variables are how long the process takes and how severe the final collapse will be. The Roman Empire took centuries to destroy its currency. The Weimar Republic took 4 years, Zimbabwe took 2 decades, Venezuela took 1 decade. The speed varies, but the destination is always identical. Currency collapse, social breakdown, and the end of the political order that created the crisis. What we are witnessing in America and Europe today is not a temporary spike in prices that will subside when supply chains normalize or when the Federal Reserve adjusts interest rates. We are witnessing the beginning stages of a currency crisis that will reshape the global economic order. The establishment wants you to believe this is manageable, that the experts have tools to control inflation and restore stability. They are lying to you, either out of ignorance or malice, and their lies will cost you everything if you believe them. If you want to understand what is really happening to your money and your future, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. The information you are about to receive is suppressed by mainstream financial media, because acknowledging these truths would cause immediate panic. But panic now, when you still have time to protect yourself, is better than panic later when it is too late. The trigger event that should have awakened every American to the reality of the inflation doom loop occurred throughout 2022 and 2023, but the way it was presented to the public deliberately obscured its significance. Consumer prices rose at rates not seen in over 40 years, with official inflation statistics showing increases of 8 to 9% annually. But these official numbers dramatically understate the real inflation experienced by ordinary people, because the methodology for calculating the consumer price index has been systematically altered over decades to produce lower numbers. If inflation were still calculated using the methodology from 1980, the current rate would be closer to 15%. If calculated using 1990 methodology, it would exceed 12%. Food prices have increased by double digits. Energy costs have doubled or tripled in many markets. Housing costs, whether rent or mortgage payments, have become unaffordable for a generation of young Americans. The government response to this crisis has followed the exact script that has been followed by every government facing the same problem throughout history. First came denial. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen both insisted throughout 2021 that inflation was transitory, a temporary phenomenon caused by supply chain disruptions from the pandemic. They assured the public that prices would naturally decline once these temporary factors resolved. This was a lie. Inflation was not transitory. It was the direct result of the Federal Reserve creating over $4 trillion in new money during 2020 and 2021 to finance government deficit spending and to purchase assets during the pandemic response. When you increase the money supply by 20% in 18 months, prices rise. This is not economics. This is arithmetic. Every additional dollar printed makes all existing dollars less valuable. Then came the pivot. By mid-2022, with inflation undeniably persistent and accelerating, the Federal Reserve reversed course and began raising interest rates at the fastest pace in history, from near zero to over 5% in just 18 months. This was presented as the solution to inflation, the responsible action of central bankers doing their job to protect price stability. But raising interest rates in an economy drowning in debt does not solve the inflation problem. It creates a new crisis that feeds back into the inflation doom loop. Higher interest rates mean higher costs to service the $33 trillion federal debt. Interest payments on the national debt now exceed $1 trillion per year and are rising. The government must borrow more money to pay the interest on existing debt. The Federal Reserve must create more money to purchase the government bonds that finance this borrowing. More money. Creation means more inflation, which requires higher interest rates, which increases debt service costs, which requires more borrowing, which requires more money printing. This is the doom loop in its purest form, and we are trapped in it. The establishment narrative insists that the Federal Reserve can engineer a soft landing, gradually reducing inflation without causing a recession. This has never been accomplished in history when inflation reaches the levels we are experiencing. Every attempt to control inflation through interest rate manipulation in a heavily indebted economy results in either runaway inflation or catastrophic recession. There is no third option because the mathematics do not allow for one. The current pause in rate increases and talk of rate cuts in 2024 signals that the Federal Reserve has chosen inflation over recession, which means we are accelerating deeper into the doom loop rather than escaping it. To understand why the inflation doom loop is inescapable, once it begins, we must examine the historical record of how governments have responded to fiscal crises throughout civilization. The pattern is universal across all cultures, all time periods, and all political systems. When a government spends more than it collects in revenue, it faces three options. It can raise taxes to cover the deficit, it can borrow money to finance the gap, or it can print money to pay its bills. Raising taxes is politically unpopular and often economically counterproductive because high tax rates reduce economic activity and can actually decrease total revenue. Borrowing requires finding creditors willing to purchase government bonds, and those creditors eventually demand higher interest rates as the debt accumulates. Printing money appears to be the path of least resistance because it creates no immediate political backlash and allows the government to continue spending without limit. This is why every government in crisis eventually chooses to print money, and this is why the doom loop always begins the same way. The Roman Empire provides the earliest well-documented case of the inflation doom loop. In the 3rd century AD, Rome faced simultaneous military threats on multiple frontiers and needed to pay for large armies to defend the empire. Rather than raise taxes on an already burdened population, successive emperors debased the Roman denarius by reducing its silver content. The denarius began as nearly pure silver under Augustus. By the time of Claudius Gothicus in 268 AD, it contained less than 5% silver. The rest was base metal. This systematic debasement caused massive inflation throughout the empire. Prices increased by over 1,000% during the 3rd century. The Roman government responded to rising prices by imposing wage and price controls, which created shortages and black markets. Economic activity collapsed. Trade networks broke down. The legions that defended the frontiers could no longer be properly supplied or paid in currency that held value, so the empire began paying soldiers in goods and land grants rather than money. This accelerated the fragmentation of imperial authority and contributed directly to the collapse of centralized Roman power. The Chinese Empire experienced multiple cycles of the inflation doom loop across its long history. The Tang dynasty collapsed in the 10th century, partly due to paper money inflation. The Yuan dynasty in the 13th century issued so much paper currency to finance military campaigns that the money became worthless, contributing to the dynasty's overthrow. The Ming dynasty in the 15th century abandoned paper money entirely after previous inflationary episodes, destroyed public confidence in fiat currency. The most famous modern example is the Weimar Republic in Germany during the early 1920s. Germany emerged from World War I with massive reparation debts imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The German government, unable to pay these debts through taxation or foreign borrowing, began printing marks to purchase foreign currency to make reparation payments. The printing accelerated throughout 1922 and 1923. Prices doubled every few days at the peak of the hyperinflation. Workers were paid multiple times per day and would rush to spend their wages immediately because the money would be worth significantly less by evening. The iconic images of Germans using wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread and using banknotes as wallpaper because they were cheaper than actual wallpaper captured the complete destruction of monetary value. The social and political consequences were catastrophic. The German middle class, which had accumulated savings in bank accounts and government bonds, was completely wiped out. Their life savings became worthless overnight. This destruction of the middle class created the conditions for political extremism. The economic chaos and resentment over the loss of savings contributed directly to the rise of the Nazi Party, which promised to restore German prosperity and dignity. The Weimar hyperinflation shows how currency collapse leads not just to economic crisis, but to political revolution and civilizational disaster. More recent examples demonstrate that modern governments equipped with contemporary economic theory and central banking institutions are no wiser than their historical predecessors. Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe provides a textbook case of the inflation doom loop in the 21st century. In the early 2000s, Mugabe seized commercial farms from white landowners and redistributed them to political supporters who lacked farming experience. Agricultural production collapsed, creating food shortages and economic contraction. Government revenues fell, but spending increased to maintain political support. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe printed money to cover the deficit. Inflation began accelerating in 2004 and reached unimaginable levels by 2008. The official inflation rate exceeded 79 billion %. Zimbabwe printed $100 trillion banknotes. The currency became worthless and the Zimbabwe dollar was eventually abandoned entirely. The country now uses foreign currencies for transactions, having destroyed its monetary sovereignty completely. Venezuela offers an even more contemporary example. Under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela used its oil wealth to finance massive social spending programs and government employment. When oil prices collapsed in 2014, government revenues fell, but spending continued. The central bank printed bolivars to cover deficits. Inflation began accelerating, reaching official rates of over 65,000% by 2018. Real inflation was likely much higher. Food shortages became endemic. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, creating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. A nation that was once the wealthiest in Latin America has been reduced to poverty and chaos by the inflation doom loop. The pattern across all these examples is identical. Government overspending creates deficits. Printing money to finance deficits causes inflation. Inflation creates economic distress and reduces real government revenues. The government prints more money to maintain spending and ease distress. More money printing causes more inflation. The cycle accelerates until the currency becomes worthless and economic activity grinds to a halt. No government has ever escaped this cycle once it begins, without either allowing a severe recession to purge the excess money from the system or implementing radical currency reform that effectively confiscates wealth from currency holders. The current trajectory of the United States and Europe shows all the warning signs of the doom loop's early stages. Government spending continues to grow faster than revenue. Central banks continue to expand their balance sheets. Real interest rates, after adjusting for inflation, remain negative, meaning that savers are being robbed in real time. The political will to implement the painful reforms necessary to break the cycle does not exist, which means the cycle will continue until external reality forces change through crisis. This brings us to the moral and political bankruptcy that underlies the economic bankruptcy. The inflation doom loop is not a natural disaster or an unfortunate accident of economic policy. It is a deliberate choice made by political leaders who understand exactly what they are doing. They are stealing from their citizens through currency debasement, and they are doing so because it is politically easier than making honest choices about taxation and spending. Inflation is the cruelest tax because it is hidden and regressive. When the government prints money, it does not send you a tax bill. Your paycheck appears unchanged, but your purchasing power silently declines. The money you earned through your labor buys less food, less fuel, less housing, less healthcare. You are working the same hours for the same nominal pay, but you are becoming poorer in real terms. This is theft, pure and simple. It is the confiscation of your wealth without your consent and without due process. The moral obscenity is compounded by the fact that inflation does not affect everyone equally. The wealthy, who own stocks, real estate, and other hard assets, see their wealth increase during inflation because asset prices rise faster than consumer prices. The middle class and poor, who live on fixed incomes or wages that lag inflation, see their savings destroyed and their standard of living collapse. Inflation transfers wealth from the bottom to the top, from savers to borrowers, from workers to asset owners. The government and the banking system, which are the primary borrowers in a debt-based economy, benefit from inflation because it reduces the real value of their debts. You, the taxpayer and worker, pay the price. The hypocrisy of the political class on this issue is staggering. Politicians from both parties give speeches about their concern for the middle class and working families while pursuing the exact policies that destroy middle-class wealth. They promise to fight inflation while voting for spending bills that require money printing to finance. They claim to protect savings while maintaining a Federal Reserve policy that guarantees negative real interest rates. The central bankers and economists who manage this system claim to be acting in the public interest, using technical expertise to manage the economy for the benefit of all. This is a lie. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It is a private banking cartel granted monopoly power over money creation. The primary dealers who are required to purchase Treasury bonds and who have first access to newly created Federal Reserve money are the largest banks on Wall Street. The system is designed to benefit these institutions at the expense of everyone else. When the Federal Reserve creates money, it does so by purchasing assets from banks, which means the banks receive the new money first before inflation has reduced its value. By the time the money reaches ordinary people through wages or benefits, inflation has already eroded its purchasing power. This is called the cantillon effect, and it explains why the wealthy keep getting wealthier while everyone else falls behind. The people who benefit from this system are not ignorant of its effects. They understand perfectly well that inflation destroys savings and impoverishes the majority. They proceed anyway because the alternative, admitting fiscal reality and cutting spending or raising taxes honestly, would cost them political power. Politicians who tell voters the truth about the unsustainability of current spending and the necessity of painful reforms lose elections to politicians who promise more spending financed by borrowing and printing. The democratic process itself becomes captured by the incentive to lie and steal through inflation rather than govern responsibly. This is the terminal stage of democracy that the ancient political philosophers warned about. When voters discover they can vote themselves benefits from the Treasury, and when politicians discover they can provide those benefits through money printing rather than taxation, the system enters a death spiral. The Roman Republic fell into this trap. The Athenian democracy fell into this trap. The United States is falling into this trap right now. The moral rot extends to the intellectual class that provides justification for these policies. Modern monetary theory, which claims that governments can print unlimited money without consequence as long as inflation remains controlled, is being taught in universities and promoted by prominent economists. This theory is not new. It is the same theory that every government throughout history has used to justify currency debasement. The Romans believed they could debase the denarius without consequence. The French believed they could print assignats during the Revolution without consequence. John Law believed he could print currency backed by Mississippi Company shares without consequence. All of them learned through catastrophe that you cannot create real wealth by printing paper. Yet here we are again, with a new generation of economists insisting that this time is different, that modern central banking has conquered the ancient problem of inflation. They are wrong. This time is not different. The mathematics are the same. The outcome will be the same. But the moral collapse is merely the visible symptom of a much deeper systemic rot. The inflation doom loop, once established, becomes self-reinforcing through mechanisms that make escape mathematically impossible without radical intervention that current political and economic structures cannot accommodate. To understand why we are trapped, we must examine the specific feedback loops that are now accelerating inflation beyond the control of monetary authorities. The first feedback loop is the wage price spiral. As prices rise, workers demand higher wages to maintain their purchasing power. Employers, facing higher labor costs, raise prices to maintain profit margins. Higher prices prompt demands for even higher wages. This cycle accelerated throughout 2023 as labor unions negotiated contracts with annual wage increases of 5 to 7%, well above historical norms. These wage increases are not generating real prosperity for workers because prices are rising at least as fast as wages. But they are embedding inflation into the cost structure of the economy, making it impossible to reduce inflation without causing mass unemployment. The Federal Reserve understands this, which is why Jerome Powell has stated explicitly that reducing inflation requires cooling the labor market, which is central banker language for increasing unemployment. The trade-off between inflation and unemployment, known as the Phillips curve, suggests that reducing inflation from current levels to the Federal Reserve's 2% target would require unemployment to rise significantly, potentially to levels not seen since the 2008 financial crisis, but causing a severe recession in an economy carrying $33 trillion in federal debt, hundreds of trillions in unfunded liabilities, and record corporate and household debt would risk triggering a deflationary collapse worse than the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve is trapped between unacceptable choices: allow inflation to continue and risk currency collapse, or cause a recession and risk financial system collapse. The second feedback loop is the debt inflation spiral. The United States government must continuously borrow money to finance deficits and roll over maturing debt. The largest purchaser of this debt has historically been the Federal Reserve, which creates new money to buy Treasury bonds. But when the Federal Reserve purchases government debt with newly created money, this increases the money supply and causes inflation. Higher inflation reduces the real value of existing debt, which appears beneficial to the government because it makes debt easier to repay. This creates an incentive for the government to tolerate or even encourage inflation as a way to reduce the real burden of its debt. But higher inflation also means higher interest rates, which means new government debt must be issued at higher rates, which increases the deficit, which requires more borrowing, which requires more Federal Reserve money creation, which causes more inflation. This cycle is now accelerating. Interest costs on federal debt have exploded from $300 billion per year in 2020 to over $1 trillion in 2024. At current borrowing rates, interest costs will exceed $2 trillion per year by 2030, consuming over 40% of federal revenue. This is unsustainable, but stopping it would require either massive spending cuts that would cause recession and political upheaval, or massive tax increases that would also cause recession. Neither option is politically viable, which means the debt inflation spiral will continue until it terminates in currency crisis. The third feedback loop is the de-dollarization spiral. The United States has been able to run enormous deficits and print unlimited money without immediate hyperinflation because the dollar is the global reserve currency. Foreign countries need dollars to conduct international trade and to hold as reserves. This foreign demand for dollars absorbs much of the newly printed money and delays the inflationary impact domestically. But the aggressive use of the dollar as a weapon, freezing the reserves of countries like Russia and Venezuela, has accelerated the efforts of much of the world to reduce dollar dependence. China, Russia, India, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia are all conducting trade in currencies other than dollars. The BRICS bloc is developing alternative payment systems. Central banks around the world are reducing dollar reserves and increasing holdings of gold and other currencies. Each step toward de-dollarization reduces foreign demand for dollars, which means more of the newly printed dollars remain in the United States, which causes more domestic inflation. Higher domestic inflation reduces confidence in the dollar, which accelerates de-dollarization. This feedback loop is particularly dangerous because it is irreversible. Once foreign countries build alternative payment infrastructure and currency relationships, they do not return to dollar dependence even if the United States stabilizes its currency. The loss of reserve currency status is permanent and the inflationary consequences are severe. When Britain lost reserve currency status in the mid-20th century, British living standards declined sharply. The United States faces the same trajectory, but the fall will be from a much greater height. The fourth feedback loop is the political spiral. As inflation erodes living standards, voters become angry and demand government action to ease their suffering. Politicians respond by proposing or implementing price controls, subsidies, increased welfare spending, student loan forgiveness, and other programs that require government spending without corresponding revenue increases. This spending must be financed by borrowing and money printing, which causes more inflation, which creates more suffering, which creates more political pressure for government intervention, which requires more spending and money printing. This cycle is visible in the current political environment. Both parties compete to offer voters relief from inflation through various spending programs and tax credits, but none seriously propose the spending cuts or tax increases needed to balance the budget. The political incentive structure makes the doom loop inevitable because politicians who tell voters the truth about the necessity of austerity lose elections to politicians who promise free money. The mathematics of compound inflation makes these feedback loops catastrophic over time. Inflation of 8% per year means prices double every 9 years. Inflation of 10% means prices double every 7 years. Inflation of 15% means prices double every 5 years. Once inflation reaches these levels, the compounding becomes explosive. Venezuela went from stable prices to hyperinflation in less than a decade. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation accelerated from double digits to millions of percent in under 5 years. The United States is currently in the early stages of this acceleration, with inflation running at levels not seen in 4 decades. If the current trajectory continues, we will see inflation rates of 15 to 20% within the next several years. And once inflation reaches those levels, it becomes nearly impossible to control without catastrophic recession or radical currency reform. This failure has triggered a global reckoning that extends far beyond monetary policy into the fundamental structure of the international financial system. The inflation doom loop in the United States is not an isolated national problem. It is the crisis of the global reserve currency, and its consequences will reshape the economic and political order that has defined the world since 1944. The Bretton Woods system established the dollar as the center of the global financial system, initially backed by gold, and later, after 1971, backed only by confidence in the United States government. This system has provided enormous advantages to the United States, allowing it to run persistent trade deficits and government deficits without immediate consequences because foreign countries were willing to hold dollars and treasury bonds. The inflation doom loop is destroying this arrangement in real time, and the consequences for American power and prosperity are profound. Countries around the world are watching the United States inflation rate, the expanding Federal Reserve balance sheet, and the spiraling federal debt, and they are concluding that the dollar is no longer a reliable store of value. This is driving the rapid acceleration of de-dollarization efforts that were already underway. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, representing over half the world's population, is developing payment systems denominated in local currencies. The BRICS bloc has announced plans for a commodity-backed currency that would compete with the dollar for international trade. Saudi Arabia, after 49 years of exclusive dollar pricing for oil under the petrodollar agreement, is now accepting yuan, rubles, and other currencies for oil sales. This is not merely a diversification of payment options. It is the dismantling of the fundamental pillar of dollar dominance. When oil is no longer priced exclusively in dollars, the global demand for dollars falls, which means foreign central banks need to hold fewer dollar reserves, which means less demand for treasury bonds, which means the Federal Reserve must purchase an even larger share of government debt, which means more money printing, which means more inflation. The doom loop extends from the domestic economy to the international system. The geopolitical consequences of losing reserve currency status compound the economic consequences. The ability to print the global reserve currency has allowed the United States to finance a military presence in over 100 countries, maintaining 800 military bases and projecting power globally. This military network requires over $800 billion per year to sustain, and it depends on the United States' ability to borrow cheaply in its own currency. When foreign demand for dollars and treasury bonds declines, interest rates must rise to attract buyers, which makes financing the military empire unsustainable. The United States will face a choice between maintaining the empire and avoiding currency collapse. History suggests that empires in this position choose to maintain military spending until the currency fails completely. The inflation doom loop also transfers wealth internationally from the United States to creditor nations. China holds over $1 trillion in treasury securities. As inflation erodes the real value of these holdings, China is essentially being robbed by American monetary policy. China understands this perfectly well, which is why they are rapidly reducing treasury holdings and diversifying into gold, commodities, and infrastructure investments through the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese are converting paper claims on American productivity into hard assets that will retain value when the dollar collapses. Other creditor nations, including Japan, South Korea, and European allies, face the same calculus. They are trapped, holding dollar assets that are losing value in real terms, but selling those assets quickly would crash the treasury market and trigger the very crisis they are trying to avoid. This is financial mutually assured destruction, and it explains why the crisis has not already occurred despite the obvious unsustainability of current trajectories. But this unstable equilibrium cannot hold indefinitely. Eventually, one major creditor nation will conclude that holding dollars is more dangerous than the consequences of selling, and their selling will trigger a cascade of selling by others. This is how currency crises begin, not gradually, but suddenly as confidence breaks all at once. The domestic consequences of the global reckoning are already visible in the American economy. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, have declined for most workers over the past 3 years, despite nominal wage increases. This means the average American is becoming poorer even while appearing to earn more money. Savings rates have collapsed as households spend down accumulated savings to maintain consumption in the face of rising prices. Credit card debt has reached record levels as people borrow to maintain their standard of living. The retail sector shows increasing signs of stress as consumers cut back on discretionary spending. The commercial real estate market faces catastrophic losses as office buildings sit vacant and owners default on mortgages they cannot refinance at higher interest rates. Regional banks continue to fail or merge, consolidating the banking system into fewer hands. These are not temporary disruptions. These are the early stages of economic restructuring driven by the inflation doom loop. The American economy is being forced to adjust to a reality where it can no longer import goods purchased with printed money. When foreign countries no longer accept dollars in exchange for real goods and resources, Americans will have to produce real value to trade. This adjustment will be brutal. The United States has offshored most of its manufacturing capacity over the past 50 years. The workforce is not trained for industrial production. The infrastructure for heavy industry has been allowed to decay. Rebuilding this capacity while simultaneously dealing with currency crisis and inflation will reduce American living standards by 30 to 50% or more. This is not speculation. This is what happened to every country that lost reserve currency status and was forced to live within its means rather than on borrowed money. We are standing at the terminal stage of a monetary experiment that has been running for 53 years since the complete abandonment of gold backing for the dollar in 1971. The inflation doom loop that has trapped every fiat currency in history has now trapped the dollar, and we face a binary choice about how this crisis will resolve. The historical record provides only 2 possible outcomes, and current policy choices are determining which path we will follow. The first path is the path of controlled demolition and reconstruction. This path requires admitting that the current monetary system has failed and implementing radical reforms before complete collapse occurs. It means allowing a severe recession that liquidates malinvestment and resets asset prices to sustainable levels. It means cutting government spending by 30 to 50% to eliminate deficits without money printing. It means restructuring the social safety net to reflect the actual productive capacity of the economy rather than promises that cannot be kept. It means allowing interest rates to rise to levels that reflect real inflation and real credit risk, which would cause widespread defaults and bankruptcies but would also clear the system of unsustainable debt. Most importantly, this path requires currency reform that restores sound money principles. This could take several forms. A return to gold backing for the dollar, which would immediately constrain government spending and eliminate the ability to print unlimited money. The introduction of a new currency to replace the inflated dollar, similar to what Germany did after the Weimar hyperinflation. The adoption of a monetary rule that strictly limits money supply growth to match real economic growth. Any of these reforms would be painful in the short term, but would preserve national sovereignty and create the foundation for sustainable prosperity. This path requires political courage that appears entirely absent from the current leadership class. The second path is the path of denial and acceleration, and this is the path that all available evidence suggests the United States has chosen. This path involves continuing to print money to finance deficits, maintaining artificially low interest rates through Federal Reserve intervention, implementing price controls to hide inflation, expanding government spending to ease the suffering caused by inflation, and desperately attempting to maintain dollar dominance through increasingly aggressive use of financial sanctions and military threats. This path leads inevitably to hyperinflation, currency collapse, and social breakdown. The final stage of the inflation doom loop is always the same. The government prints money faster and faster, trying to keep pace with rising prices. Prices rise faster and faster, trying to stay ahead of money printing. The velocity of this spiral increases until the currency becomes worthless in a matter of weeks or even days. At this point, economic activity ceases because nobody will accept the currency in payment. Barter replaces money. The government, unable to pay its employees or finance its operations with worthless currency, loses the ability to function. Social order breaks down as police and military personnel abandon their posts because their pay is worthless. This is not distant history. This is what happened in Zimbabwe in 2008, in Venezuela in 2018, in Lebanon in 2020. It is what will happen in the United States if the current trajectory continues. The historical pattern shows that governments always choose the second path because the first path requires admitting failure and imposing immediate pain on voters. Politicians prefer to delay the crisis and hope that somehow the situation resolves itself or that they will be out of office before the final collapse occurs. This is not malice. It is cowardice and short-term thinking institutionalized in democratic systems that reward promises over responsibility. The tragedy of the inflation doom loop is that it is entirely preventable at any point up until the final crisis, but it is never prevented because prevention requires sacrifice that democratic populations will not voluntarily accept. When the collapse comes, and the mathematics guarantee it will come unless radical policy changes occur immediately, the government will implement emergency measures that attempt to preserve their power while appearing to address the crisis. These measures will include capital controls that prevent you from moving money out of the country or out of the banking system. They will include the forced conversion of bank accounts and retirement savings into government bonds or new currency at confiscatory exchange rates. They will include price controls that create shortages and black markets. They will include the implementation of central bank digital currencies that allow complete surveillance and control of all transactions. They will include expanded government powers justified by the emergency. When you read this list, you might think it sounds like conspiracy theory, but every single one of these measures has been implemented by governments facing currency crisis. Argentina has implemented capital controls. Cyprus confiscated bank deposits. Venezuela implemented price controls. China has implemented digital currency surveillance. These are not hypotheticals. They are the standard playbook for governments facing the inflation doom loop. This channel exists to tell you these truths while you still have time to act. The inflation doom loop is not a future possibility. It is happening right now. Your savings are being destroyed. Your wages are being devalued. Your future is being stolen through currency debasement. The mainstream financial media will not tell you this because they are dependent on the very financial institutions that benefit from the current system. Subscribe to this channel immediately and turn on all notifications. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand what is coming. The time to prepare is not after the crisis begins. It is now, while you can still take action to protect yourself. I want to hear from you in the comments below. First, do you believe the United States government and Federal Reserve will voluntarily implement the painful reforms necessary to break the inflation doom loop, or will they continue printing money until the currency collapses? Second, what specific actions are you taking to protect your wealth? Are you moving savings into gold, silver, real estate, or foreign currencies? Are you reducing debt? Are you building skills and stockpiling goods that will retain value when the dollar fails? The inflation doom loop is a mathematical certainty, not a political opinion. We have seen this pattern throughout history, and it ends the same way every time. The only question is whether you will be prepared when it happens. Leave your answers in the comments. I will be reading every one of them.